Welcome everyone to tonight's Fertility Network UK webinar on using a donor during your fertility treatment. My name is Bethan, my pronouns are she, her, and I work for Fertility Network UK, providing support to people on the fertility journey. To let you know, this session, it is being recorded tonight, so you'll be able to watch it back as we'll share it on our YouTube and social media channels. And just to let you know, for that reassurance as well, we are only recording and we can only see the speakers. Please do ask any questions you want. If you can just pop them in the Q&A channel, we'll get through as many as we can. I will ask them on your behalf. So without further ado, let's begin tonight's session on using a donor in fertility treatment. And I'm beyond delighted to be joined by Debra Bloor, who is the Director of Governance at Care Fertility Group. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you so much, Bethan, for that lovely introduction. I'm really pleased to be here, and as Bethan said, please feel free to ask any questions you'd like of me. So I've been asked to talk to you tonight about using donor sperm, eggs or embryos in your treatment, and I work for Care Fertility, and my role is Director of Governance, which is a bit of a mouthful really. But my background was that I worked for a long time with the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, who I'm sure lots of you have heard of. And so I am pretty familiar with the law as it applies to using donor eggs, sperm or embryos. So I'm going to talk to you tonight really about what the law requires, and also a little bit about professional body guidelines, and then hopefully I can empower you to ask all the right questions if you're seeking treatment. So Bethan asked me to talk about these subjects, and I'm going to try really hard not to commit to bore you to death with PowerPoint, but I have got a bunch of slides, but after the slides I'll be really happy to answer any questions. So first of all, I was going to talk to you a bit about how we select donors and what screening our donors go through. And the important context of this is that most of these requirements come directly from the law. So your fertility clinic or the HFEA have no real ability to allow donors to be recruited who don't meet their guidelines, because it's actually the law that requires that they meet certain specifications. Interestingly, though, not the age of donors. That's set by what we call the professional body, so it's kind of guidance. And I'll explain a bit about what that means later. So all egg donors are aged 35 or less when they're recruited. And sperm donors have to be aged 45 or less. And if you think that seems a little discriminatory, there's some sort of scientific background to this. I don't know if you'll know, but when a person who's a woman at birth is born, they have all of the eggs they'll ever have sitting in their ovaries, ready to be released. You're born with 1 million or so eggs, already reduced to about 300,000. The number of eggs in the ovaries diminishes over time. By the time a woman at birth reaches puberty, they'll have probably 300,000, and then over time that number continues to diminish, which is why a woman at birth becomes infertile over time. And the reason we select egg donors aged 35 or less is because we want to make sure that they have a healthy number of eggs in their ovaries and give our recipients the very best chance of success when they have treatment with those eggs. Sperm production continues in the testes forever, and sperm are made anew every time in the testicles. And so the same issues of the eggs that affect eggs potentially, which are hanging around in the ovaries and might be subject to environmental damage or just aging, that doesn't happen to sperm, which is why sperm donors can be slightly older than egg donors. I said these restrictions on the age of donors are set by professional bodies, so they're guidelines, not the law. So the time when this becomes most important perhaps is if you were seeking treatment with the eggs or sperm of a known donor who didn't quite meet those age criteria, in which case you could potentially ask your clinic to have special consideration and think about whether they could use the eggs or sperm of those donors. And that's a possibility. And the HFEA would allow us as clinics to do that from time to time, as long as we fully inform you about the possible risks. So all egg and sperm donors have to be free from incurable viruses like HIV, hepatitis, and a virus called HTLV, which affects only specific people from a specific background. And we screen all donors for these 3 conditions. And they also have to be negative for sexually transmitted infections, syphilis, chlamydia, and gonorrhea. There's a bit of background here. Where if you're fortunate enough to be able to use the sperm, and it just applies to sperm, the sperm of a partner who you have an intimate relationship with, the law that was drafted a long, long time ago, remember, kind of recognizes that your risk of catching infections from the sperm provider is probably highest because you're in an intimate physical relationship, probably. And so we're only required to screen a partner if they're providing sperm for HIV and hepatitis. We also screen someone having an egg collection for chlamydia because we don't want to introduce chlamydia into a woman's organs when we're doing the egg collection. But so the risk of catching one of these illnesses from a partner that you're having an intimate relationship with is much greater than the risk would be from having fertility treatment. But of course, if you're using donated eggs or sperm and you're not in an intimate relationship, you have absolutely zero risk of catching an infection from them. And so we screen donors to a higher level. I think it's quite interesting. After the COVID pandemic, we're all really familiar with NAT testing. And NAT testing is an advanced type of testing that tests for the presence of viruses, whereas we screen partners usually looking for the presence of antibodies in their blood, things like HIV and hepatitis. But when we screen donors, we also screen using NAT testing sometimes, which allows us to actually be even more sure that the donor is free of HIV and hepatitis. So we do that we do that advanced screening for all donors, and that would be the same for known donors. And that helps us minimize any risk whatsoever of someone catching an infection from the egg or sperm donor. The law also requires us to check our donors for recessive genes that might be prevalent in someone of the donor's ethnic background. So by recessive genes, I'm talking about genes for things like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease or thalassemia. And the reason we test for recessive genes is because you need 2 copies of these genes in order to for your child to inherit a condition. And so if we know that the egg or sperm donor doesn't carry a recessive gene that might put a future child at risk of things like cystic fibrosis, then we can manage the risk of a child being born with those conditions, because those recessive genes are fairly common in the general population. We don't screen for what's known as dominant genes, because if a donor had a dominant genetic condition, then they would have that condition and we would know about it. And that links into the next way we screen our donors. So all donors are asked, they are selected on the basis of their age, but we also ask them to fill in a questionnaire that tells us about their health and their medical history. And we also usually meet with them and interview them and ask them about their medical history. And when I talk about their history, I'm talking about sometimes we ask them about their first-degree relatives. So have their mother or father or grandparents or siblings got any conditions, any health conditions, which might possibly be inherited? So that's really important, but it clearly is it's only as important, if you like, as the level of information that the donor themselves perhaps knows. And so, for example, if we have a young donor, their parents might be perfectly healthy, and but say at some point in the future they might develop a health condition. So it's kind of based on what we know at the time when the donor is selected. And if you took me, for example, in my family, my mother has asthma and she has thyroid deficiency. She doesn't produce enough thyroid hormone. And my dad sadly died really young of heart disease. So I probably wouldn't be accepted as a donor because those conditions have elements which make them heritable. And in fact, my sister has the same thyroid deficiency, and lo and behold, one of my children also carries that same condition. So the types of things that we reject a donor for is if there's an evidence from their medical history and their family history that there might be a serious medical condition in their background which could be inherited. Interestingly, although thyroid deficiency was inherited by my children, one of my children, my mum's asthma never came through. And in fact, my dad, probably his heart disease was related to very heavy smoking when he was young. So you can see that this is a kind of art as much as the science, and we take all these things into consideration. And we're quite cautious, I would say. Most clinics are quite cautious, and we don't accept donors where there is any indication that there might be a health condition, a serious health condition in their family background that could be inherited by a future child.
Debra,
so, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but we've had a question that's quite pertinent to this section, and that is, how do you verify the information provided by the donors and if the information provided is truthful? Thank you.
Most clinics, it's not compulsory, but most clinics, like ours, we would usually write to an egg or sperm donor's doctor, their GP, and ask if their GP knows reasons why they shouldn't donate. And actually, there is a little bit of protection for recipients in law. So if you think about really, really serious health conditions, I don't know if the people watching would be familiar with a horrible condition called Huntington's chorea, which is a dominant condition, but which is quite late onset. So a young person might not know that their family was affected by it. But if someone knowingly donated their eggs or sperm and they had a medical condition which they hadn't revealed, and which I think the phraseology, I can't quite quote the legislation perfectly, is they had it was reasonable for them to know that this was part of their medical history, and they withheld it knowingly. If a child was to be born in the future, the law does actually allow the donor's identity to be revealed and for legal action to be taken by the family of the affected children. And we make sure that when we speak to our donors, that they know it's really, really important to be open and honest and transparent about their medical history. So I hope that answers the question. Does that kind of provide some reassurance? So now to a much happier bit, really. This is how you get to choose your donor. So all our donors, I have to say, I think donors are amazing. They do, they're helping people have a family who might not otherwise be able to. And of course, they're all very different. And when you're choosing your donor, usually the access that you'll get most usually from clinics is information about their appearance, particularly their height, their weight, their eye and hair color. And again, I'd say you have to remember that things like this, people's physical characteristics, are really, complicated, and it's not just about your donor's characteristics. If you're using donor sperm, the egg provider's characteristics will play a part, and vice versa. So all of these things, we can provide you with information, but it's important to weigh up the possibilities. And a really simplistic thing to think about is, for example, I have brown eyes, all my children have brown eyes, but my mother had blue eyes. That means that I would have both a blue-eye gene and a brown-eye gene, and any of my children could have both of those. So just because your donor is has brown eyes doesn't mean your children will necessarily have brown eyes, depending on what the other gamete provider's background is. So I think we all know this, you know, our physical characteristics are a combination, a blend of the genes that the child inherits from both the egg and the sperm. I think a really amazing thing that we ask our donors to do is to write a message about themselves, a description and a goodwill message. Certainly when I worked at the HFEA back in the early 2000s, when there was first discussions about, there's a lot of social science in research that was showing the benefits of helping children who were donor conceived understand their background from a really, really early age. So it's a completely normal part of their life. And the goodwill message was thought to represent an opportunity for families to talk about an egg or sperm provider in the context of, you know, oh, you're the person who kindly, you know, gave us their sperm so that you could be born was a really keen fisherman, or was a great musician, or was a fabulous painter, or something like that. So if a donor chooses to, they can give us a description of themselves and a goodwill message, and most clinics will give you that, or should give you that in advance when you're choosing your donor, and they will give it to you in the format that the donor has provided it. So if it's handwritten, for example, and you know, sometimes you might see someone's handwriting or spelling mistakes or something like that, we try and share it because we feel that that's a picture of the donor, a more sort of holistic, all-round picture of the donor. And some of these messages are amazing. And clearly we'll tell you about your donor's ethnic background, because that might be important to you, particularly when you consider the appearance of your future children. So in addition to these basic pieces of information, the HFEA Act also allows you to know the year and country of your chosen donor's birth. I would say that's, you know, interesting, but I'm not quite sure how useful it would be when selecting a donor. It can tell you whether they had any children at the time of donation, how many, and their gender. I suppose that might be interesting and useful if you're thinking about future sibling relationships, and or whether a donor has proven fertility. And you can know their marital status and some information about their medical history, as I've kind of described, as sorts of information we get on questionnaires. And that might be interesting or important to you, particularly if you have a particular family history that you might want to avoid duplicating in your donor to reduce the risks to your future child. But as I say, it's not it's an art more than a science, I would say, when you're looking at someone's medical history. So these are all the things you can know in advance to help you choose your donor. And interestingly, when I first started working for Care back in 2016, we had a fabulous couple came to talk to us about how they had chosen their donor. And one thing that was really important to them was that their child, because they knew or thought they would only ever have one child, and they wanted their child to be able to be sort of able to entertain themselves and be calm, and they chose a fisherman because they felt that someone who enjoyed fishing was probably someone who enjoyed their own company. No, I thought that was a lovely story. So talking a little bit about the treatment types, you know, what treatment might look like. And there are lots of different ways that we can create families in the fertility sector. If one partner is able to carry a pregnancy, then you could choose to have IUI, and this is probably the most basic form of fertility treatment, where we monitor the production of eggs and at the right time inseminate the person who's going to carry the pregnancy with donated sperm. And sometimes we might put in a little what we call ovarian stimulation, where we might encourage the ovaries to produce eggs to go along with IUI, but IUI is about the most basic form of fertility treatment that you can have with donor sperm. But you do need to have one partner who's able to carry the pregnancy in that situation. Obviously, you can have treatment with IVF, and the basic treatment pathway for IVF is to stimulate the ovaries with some medication. So I'm sure you'll be aware that mostly the ovaries produce just one egg per month, which might then be fertilized and result in a pregnancy. But when we're doing IVF, we want to have more than one egg. We want to have the best chance possible of having a cohort of eggs that we can select the best embryo from. And so we give some medication which mimics the body's natural hormones to encourage more than one egg to develop. And then we do an egg collection through a very fine needle into the ovaries. We collect the eggs into a dish, and then we mix them with the sperm that has been chosen or that we're using, the partner sperm we're using, and we create embryos that we then go on to transfer into the uterus of the person who is going to carry the pregnancy. Clearly, if you're using donor eggs for treatment, the donor is the person who undergoes the ovarian stimulation and the egg collection. And if you were going down the donor egg pathway of treatment, you probably have two options to choose from. So at Care, we tend to freeze a donor's eggs, and then the eggs are in our bank, ready to be chosen and thawed and used by a recipient when they're ready at their own kind of leisure. Whereas some clinics might do what we call fresh egg donation, where the egg donor, their cycle is synchronized with the recipient's cycle. There are pros and cons of both methods, but it's something worth discussing with your clinic, which method you prefer, which type of treatment you prefer to have. And it depends what each individual clinic offers, of course. Obviously, if you're using donor sperm, either with your own eggs or donated eggs, that sperm also is collected from the donor and frozen and then moved to your selected clinic. And then on the day of embryo creation, we thaw that sperm and mix it with the eggs and create embryos ready for embryo transfer. There are some additional treatments within IVF. So you might be a heterosexual couple using donor eggs or donor sperm or even donor embryos. Or you might be a same-sex couple. One of the treatments which I think is particularly lovely is is what we call shared motherhood or shared parenthood, where you have a same-sex female couple where one of the couple provide the eggs, and then the embryos are created and transferred, and the partner carries the pregnancy. And then a sort of nuanced version of this is also we do something sometimes called co-parenting, where two people choose to have treatment together, either with or without donated eggs or sperm, where they are not in a relationship, but they choose to sort of both be the legal parents of their future child. Now, obviously, in IVF, again, IVF requires one partner to carry a pregnancy. So if you don't have a partner who's able to carry a pregnancy, or perhaps a male or a same-sex male couple, then you're probably you will need to use a surrogate to carry the pregnancy for you. And obviously, donated eggs perhaps in that scenario. Just I won't go into too much detail on surrogacy because I'm sure you perhaps have different sessions on surrogacy. Surrogacy is quite a complicated treatment pathway, and the law at the moment would only allow you to have surrogacy if you were using donated eggs, if one of the legal parents was providing the sperm for the treatment, because in surrogacy, one of the intended parents has to be genetically related to their future child in order to be able to get a parental order. But these are the various options you have for treatment pathway, and really, quite genuinely, I think in the world of IVF, family is for everyone, and I'd recommend that you speak to your chosen clinic about the different treatment pathways and options, because I'm sure there will be one that's right for you. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the various elements of the pathway. So if I mentioned that donors are screened for infectious conditions, but also if you're using donor eggs or sperm, but you're also either you or your partner are providing eggs or sperm, then you will have to be screened for HIV and hepatitis. If you're having surrogacy treatment, because your eggs or sperm will be used to create an embryo that will be transferred to someone you're not in an intimate relationship with, we have to also quarantine donor sperm and screen the egg or sperm providers in the same way that we'd screen a donor. So a higher level and sadly more expensive level of screening if you're using and accessing surrogacy. Technically, and this is quite detailed, and I apologise if this doesn't make any sense. The law, and you have to remember the law was drafted a long time ago, back in 1990, and we've come a long way since then. The law only recognises a sperm provider as a partner, and I know that must sound shocking, and there are efforts being made to actually change the law to recognise that an egg provider could also be a partner. But the law currently requires a woman at birth who's providing eggs for her partner's treatment to be screened as a donor. But because so many of us in clinics and presumably in society too have pushed back on our regulator and said, this is really unfair, at the moment, we have got sort of special dispensation not to screen egg providers in that way. So if you're having shared motherhood treatment, I'd really recommend that you talk to your treating clinic really carefully about the screening that you have to have, and push back on them if they want you to be screened as a donor, because we're not actually technically being required to do that. There might be good reasons why you'd want to be, but we don't actually have to at the moment.
Debra, I've actually got a follow-up question to that in the chat, if I may. So we're just wondering the legalities for reciprocal IVF regarding, do my wife's eggs need to be frozen before the transfer, or can it be fresh? I heard that they now need to be frozen for 3 months for reciprocal IVF as they're considered donor eggs, and I want to make sure I know my options. Thank you.
I think that's a really, really good question. And it goes back to this nuance of the difference between the law and professional body guidance. So the law, the HFEA impose on us something called standard license conditions, and we have to follow those standard license conditions, or we'd be in breach of our license and we could incur regulatory sanctions. But the HFEA's standard license conditions say, yes, a sperm provider, their sperm has to be frozen and quarantined for 3 months if it's going to be used in a treatment which would involve someone that the sperm provider isn't in a relationship with, an intimate relationship with. As I said, it doesn't quite say that for an egg provider. But interestingly, the law says I, as a clinic, have to screen my egg provider for HIV and hepatitis, but it's only guidance that those eggs have to be frozen, and that the egg provider, in the same way that the sperm provider is, has to be rescreened 3 months after the samples were stored. So the answer is, some clinics may choose to require you to freeze your eggs for 3 months and then be rescreened. This is just my personal opinion, it seems to me unfair to require that. And some clinics will push back on the regulator and say, we have considered the risks of this, and this is guidance, and we're not going to follow that guidance. But remember that each clinic is different, and they will want to talk to you about the potential risks of not following professional body guidance. And people have different tolerances for, following the guidance to the letter, or perhaps, choosing to allow patients to make a choice when they're fully informed of the risks. So it's not a straightforward answer, but freezing of eggs and quarantine for 3 months is a requirement. It's not a legal requirement. It's professional body guidelines. It's guidance. So ask your clinic, ask them why they choose to make you do that. Ask them if you don't want to, what the risks are, and whether they would consider allowing you to not follow that professional body guideline.
Thank you, Debra.
So as part of the pathway, everybody always has to have a welfare of the child assessment. This is part of the law, again, that goes back to 1990. And we do this by questionnaire only. So we will ask anyone who's going to be the parent of a child and their partner, if they have one, to make some declarations about whether, their history and background, and whether or not they've ever had a child taken into care, for example, and some other questions. Though the format of that questionnaire, all I would say is be open and honest, and don't worry too much about providing information. Sometimes we see patients who've had quite significant psychiatric illness in the past. Sometimes these assessments must feel quite daunting, I imagine, if you're filling them in. And clearly people may be afraid that their clinic might refuse them treatment. What I'd say is, whatever it is in your background, if there's something you're worried about, talk to your clinic and be open and honest. I know that certainly we would want to make sure everyone's treated fairly. And if something does come up on an assessment, then we might just seek additional information. For example, if someone has a history of a criminal background, we might seek information from their probation officer or their lawyer or something like that, that might tell us whether that person does pose a risk of harm to their future child. And I would argue that most often that is not the case. But we would treat people fairly and make sure that that assessment is done thoughtfully, and the threshold is that someone has to be at risk of posing a serious risk of harm to a future child, and then we might refuse treatment if that was the case, but it's pretty unusual.
Debra, I've got 2 follow-up questions to this. So the first, my clinic has requested for this assessment a document from my GP and psychiatrist, as I have anxiety. I'm petrified this means they will refuse my treatment. Is this okay? And is this normal?
It is pretty normal, I'd say, and I'd love to say it's absolutely fine. One of the things, but of course, I can really kind of only speak about my own organisation on this one, I'm afraid. But this would be what I'd say is that, first and foremost, yes, we have to think about the welfare of a future child. That's a requirement. That's a legislative requirement. The law says I have to do that. But also, we have to think about you too. And we have to make sure that your health and well-being is taken care of, and it's that actually it's safe for you to have treatment. And if your clinic is a good one, they will ask for that information, but they will also be willing to work with anyone who's providing you with treatment. And that might be a psychiatrist, but it could be a renal physician or a cardiologist or something. So if you have any form of health problem that might impact on your future treatment, I would really encourage you to speak with your clinic, to be open and honest, and a good clinic will work with the person who's providing you with treatment so that you have all the support and care you need while you're having treatment, and that we don't put your health at risk. So I want to really encourage you to kind of trust us. I would hope, as I say, I guess I can only speak for my own organisation, but I would hope that everyone would treat people completely fairly, but also put not just the welfare of a child, but the welfare of all of our patients at the front and centre of what we do. So yeah, please don't be afraid. I'd really encourage you to be confident to share, and then ask them to help you make sure you get all the support you need.
Thank you. And the second question in relation to this topic, which I'm not entirely sure is for you, but it is, are parents who have children naturally required to complete a welfare of the child assessment?
Of course not. No, no, it's not. And I think so. I teach students actually who are entering the profession, the embryology profession, and and we often talk about this. And I think this really goes back to the place we were in 1990, when, in order to allow this treatment to be accepted by society, various measures were put in place, like a welfare of the child assessment, and actually like counselling too. I didn't have to be counselled about the decision to have a child, because I didn't need assisted conception, and I was lucky. But the law put these measures in place. Again, this is just my opinion and my knowledge of the way the Act was derived. The law put these measures in place because it was trying to assuage the fears of the broader society, and that welfare of the child assessment is just it's a questionnaire that patients are asked to complete. And on rare occasions, it throws something up where we might gather extra information, either from a person's doctor, or, as I said, if someone has a criminal conviction, it might be from their solicitor or their probation officer. But broadly, these assessments are quite light touch, if that makes sense. But yeah, I'm the last person to claim that the law is fair and just, but we have to operate within the constraints of that law, I'm afraid. And that goes to counselling. So the law, and this is what the law actually says, is that the consent is kind of the backbone of fertility treatment. And I would argue that fertility treatment is very, very different from any other healthcare treatment. If any one of us this evening needed to go to hospital and have our appendix out, then we would be giving consent. And it would be consent to a procedure that only affects us in that moment, and hopefully is going to make us well after we've been ill. When someone gives consent to the creation of an embryo, that embryo, the law says that only the egg and sperm provider can ever give their consent. Nobody can give consent on behalf of an egg or sperm provider. So unlike the fact that your next of kin can consent to your organs being used if you die, nobody can consent to someone's eggs or sperm being used. Only the people who provided those eggs and sperm. And when that embryo is created, that embryo has a potential for being stored and then being used in the future, potentially when the egg or sperm provider have died. So the decisions that people make when they give their consent to the use of their eggs and sperm are really quite different from any other field of life. And I think, again, if we go back to 1990, when people were putting the law together, they felt that if you're going to make these really huge decisions, you should be given the opportunity to speak to someone who wasn't involved in your treatment, who was an expert, to help you, talk through and think through some of the implications of those decisions. And the law says you have to be offered counselling before you give consent to the use of your eggs or sperm or the storage of your embryos. It doesn't say you have to have counselling, but most clinics, including Care, will say it's our policy that you have to have counselling about the implications of the future treatment that you're embarking on. So again, this is a deviation of most clinics from the law to impose a requirement which isn't actually required by law, but most people feel is really, really beneficial to people who are having treatment with donor egg, sperm or embryos, or having surrogacy treatment. So counselling is the offer of counselling is mandatory. It's absolutely mandatory, but it's not actually the law that it's done, but most clinics require you to have it. So now I can go into this is this is a really complicated bit about legal parenthood. And this comes back to consent. So the law, when the law allowed a person, a child to have a second parent of either gender, it imposed a bunch of strict requirements around how that second parent could be nominated, if you like, or what requirements had to be met to make that person a child's second parent. And it's a bit nuanced because a legal parenthood really only applies if someone is using donor sperm. And the reason for that is if you're using donor eggs, a donor would never be considered to be the legal parent of a child because the birth parent of a child is always their legal parent. And actually, the birth parent is always their legal mother. Even if a trans man were to give birth to a child, sadly, the law at the moment would only recognise them as a child's legal mother. So legal parenthood isn't an issue if you're using donor eggs because the person who gives birth to that child is that child's legal parent. The law says very specifically that a sperm donor must never be considered the legal parent of a child, and I think we can understand why that exists. So the law says if donor sperm is used in treatment, then the child's second legal parent can be a nominated person. Now, again, I think one of the people on the webinar was asking about whether things are fair, and also nervous about giving information out to clinics. And I think maybe people need to know why clinics are asking for information. So it's absolutely crucial that a clinic, if you're using donor sperm, that a clinic knows what your relation status is. And it makes me sad that some patients might think we're asking that question because there's some judgment implied on whether or not you're married or in a civil partnership or not. And that is totally not the case. The reason that we need to know your relationship status is because the law, again, crazy as it might sound, the law says that if you are giving birth to a child and you are legally married or in a civil partnership, your spouse or civil partner will automatically be your child's legal second parent. You don't have to fill in any forms. The law just recognises a spouse or civil partner as a child's legal parent. And so if we find out you're married, we know that we don't have to ask you to do legal parenthood consent forms. If you're not married or in a civil partnership, then the person who is giving birth to the child, who will be that child's birth mother, legal parent, even if the birth parent was using her partner's or their partner's eggs, that birth parent is the legal parent of the child. Sorry about that. So I switched my notifications off. If you're not married, then the birth parent can consent to their partner being the legal parent of their child. They must do a consent. It's called a WP. It actually stands for Woman Parenthood, and her partner must then consent to being a child's legal parent on something called a PP, which is a partner parenthood consent form. So when we ask you in clinics, if you're having treatment with donor sperm, in fact, we ask everybody, what is your relationship status? The reason we ask that question is not because of some judgment, it's just because it's absolutely vital we know the answer to that question so we can give you the opportunity to fill in forms and become your child's legal parent officially. So the truth is, if you're single and you're having treatment with donor sperm, you don't have to fill in any parenthood consent forms because there won't be a second parent. You'll be the birth parent will be the child's only legal parent. If you're married or in a civil partnership, the law recognises you. Now, and this is a bit nuanced, the only extra form you would have to fill in those circumstances is the non-birth partner can choose to consent to posthumous birth registration. And they have to fill in a form called a PBR, posthumous birth registration, to allow a child born after they were to die to have their name on and be cited as their child's legal parent. But that's really very, very specific out there stuff. And if you're not married or in a civil partnership, you have to, both the birth parent and the second parent must give their consent. And the key to this, and this is where legal parenthood consent forms that's caused problems in the past, is that they must be completed before insemination or embryo transfer. If errors are in those forms and the baby is the embryo is transferred before the forms are fixed, then it's too late. And sometimes, sadly, clinics, including my own, have had to help parents become recognised by a court as a legal parent of their children. And it's really traumatic and horrible. So bear with us if we ask you a lot of deaf questions about your marital status, and we spend a lot of time making sure that you filled in the right forms. And then the other element is, of course, sometimes people's status changes. So clinics like ours will keep asking you the same questions again and again. It's not because we're silly and we don't record things properly. We just want to make sure that nothing's changed. And one key bit of this is, if you've got a same-sex female couple having treatment together, perhaps with shared motherhood, sometimes that couple can switch and then they have to redo the forms, because it's always crucial that the birth parent gives consent on a WP and the non-birth parent gives their consent to being a child's legal parent on a PP form. So again, if you're in a same-sex female relationship and you've been doing shared motherhood and you might switch your roles, you will have to do all those forms again. So I hope that helps understand why we might ask lots of questions, and we're really, really careful to make sure that we've got it spot on right, because we genuinely never want someone to be in a position of being worried that they might not be their child's legal parent. So just a few bits of information about what you can find out about a donor when you're a donor-conceived child age 16. So you can see all the same information that was accessible to parents. I talked about the pen portrait, you can access that, and also information about the city of birth, the marital status, and so on. You can also ask the HFEA, a donor-conceived child at age 16 can ask the HFEA about the number and sex and year of birth of any genetically related siblings. And most importantly, and again, you can see why this was put into the Act back in 1990, a donor-conceived child who won't know the identity of their donor at age 16, or wouldn't be able to find out the identity of their donor at age 16, can ask the HFEA if they might be related to someone they intend to marry, have a civil partnership with, or intend to enter into a relationship with. And I think we can all kind of understand why the law put those measures in place to give people reassurance about not accidentally having a relationship with someone who was a sibling. At age 18, then a donor-conceived child can find out the donor's name and date of birth and their last known address. And at the same time, they can also join the HFEA's donor sibling link. And if any of their genetic related siblings also give their details to the donor sibling link, they'll be able to find out their contact details. And then finally, the 10 family limit. So this might be really important for people to sort of get their heads around. So the law says that the maximum number of families a donor can have in the UK is 10. But the way the 10 family limit is calculated is actually quite permissive. So here we have our couple and they have their donor conceived child. But sadly, things don't go so well and they end up splitting up. And then they both go on to have a new relationship with a different person. Now, clearly, they both started off their journey and they're both the legal parents of this donor-conceived child here. If they wanted to have more children in the future, they could, using that same donor, because these children here are genetically related siblings for this child, and this person is their legal parent and is the same legal parent of these children. And that would be the same case even if this person's partner gave birth to these children. They would all be considered one family. So one donor, one family. all the children who are related to each other through their legal parents would be considered one family. But it's important to know that that only applies in the UK. And I certainly know that we're looking at our patient information to make sure that where people choose to use donors from overseas, we try and make sure they have information on the total number of families that could possibly be created internationally, although of course there is no single consensus on how many families that should be limited to. So I think in short, that's it. And I hope you've got lots of time to ask me some more questions. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that's been useful. And there's a link there to some information about becoming the legal parent of your child, because I know that's really important. So happy to stop sharing now, shall I?
Thank you, Debra. That would be fab. I've got a couple of questions come through. Okie dokie. Apologies to those, firstly, that sent a question when Debra was talking and I missed it, but I'm going back through them now. So the first question, which came at the beginning, is type 1 diabetes one of the medical conditions that would make a donor unsuitable? We have seen some donors have extensive health screening. Do you know if type 1 or if someone is carrying the gene that makes them can't pronounce the word susceptible for it? Is that included in the extensive screening?
I'm not a doctor, and I'd struggle to answer that question categorically, I'm afraid. I would ask in your clinic. I have a suspicion, yes, we wouldn't accept a donor with type 1 diabetes, early onset type 1 diabetes. But I couldn't be 100% sure, so ask in your clinic. As I said, the law only requires us to do screening for a small number of conditions that might be prevalent in a donor's background. It's interesting that the question about screening, there is, we're constantly evolving how we work and what we can and can't do. And there is something called extended carrier screening, ECS. And some donor sperm banks, for example, apply these huge panels of thousands of recessive genes to the donors. But it's a bit complicated at the moment because the professional bodies tell us as clinics that we shouldn't accept donors with recessive genes. And the truth is that nearly all of us will carry some recessive genes, or we just will. And if you look for enough of them, you will find a donor has one or two of them. So I think going forward, and if you do access a sperm bank, one of the Danish sperm banks, for example, or the US sperm banks, sometimes they offer sperm donors that have been subject to extended carrier screening. And some of the banks, I think, allow patients to choose several donors and then have what's called counter screening. So if you're having donor sperm, if you're purchasing donor sperm from them, the egg provider would provide a copy of their DNA, a sample of their DNA, usually a saliva sample, and then those banks do what's called counter screening, and they make sure that the egg and sperm providers don't share any common recessive genes, so put the future child at risk of inheriting a condition. But extended carrier screening isn't really fully embedded yet, and I know that the professional bodies are working on some guidance for clinics on how to manage these complex issues. And of course, it carries extra cost to have counter screening and things. And I think it's a dilemma when you're using frozen donated eggs or sperm, that how far do you go to protect a future child, if you like, from illnesses where those of us who somewhat carelessly don't have any of their screening wouldn't perhaps go to such lengths. But I think it's interesting that will come.
Thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming in. So this one I think has been answered already, but I'll quickly ask again for a quick answer. Would my wife, same-sex relationship, be recognised as a legal parent if we were to do reciprocal IVF, with me being the birth parent carrying her egg?
If you're married or in a civil partnership, yes. Without forms, yes.
Thank you.
You could equally be with forms if not married or in a civil partnership. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think so long as you use a fertility clinic and you sign the forms, you'll both be the legal parent on conception, and that's quite important, not at birth, at
Yes,
conception.
absolutely.
Thank you.
And you can't withdraw that consent once it's been given after the transfer or the insemination. But you are right. I'm thinking I'm approaching this from the concept of a licensed fertility treatment. That is not true. The law only abrogates a sperm donor of their parental responsibilities of being a child's legal parent if they've given consent under the terms of the Act. So
Yeah. And using a fertility clinic, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. So for those more interested in this with regards to not using a fertility clinic, we have got an upcoming Pathways to Parenthood course for the LGBTQ plus community, and Natalie Gamble, a leading expert in this, will be talking through options outside of a fertility clinic. So stay tuned for that. Okay, next question. Is this law for the forms the same if treatment is done abroad?
no. So the legal parenthood forms only apply to treatment provided in the UK.
Thank you. Oh, someone asking, can I see the age 18 page again, please? We might need a bit of a follow-up question to that if we get time. If not, always email me. It's bethan@fertilitynetworkuk.org, and I will take that question and answer it for you outside of this space. What should you consider when choosing where to get the donor sperm from?
Ooh, I think that the clinic just has to meet your needs in terms of the donors that they're able to provide. Um, I'd say that any treatment provided in the UK is always subject to exactly the same regulations. So the quality, if you like, of screening and recruitment should meet all the standards I've talked about. So I'd say um, anywhere really. I think the only thing to remember, if you're having treatment in the UK and you want to transfer in sperm from abroad, the donor has to have given their permission to have their identity revealed to a child at age 18. So they have to be what's known as identity release donors. So if you're choosing from an overseas bank, then you can only choose a donor who's had consented to their identity being released.
Thank you. I wholly suspect this will be dependent on sperm bank, and with regards to your clinic, Deborah, but a question's come through. How long does it take from choosing sperm to starting treatment?
I'm really sorry, I couldn't. I don't work in the actual those
Yeah.
elements of the treatment, so I wouldn't like to speculate. I'm sorry.
Another question, which might be a similar, how many vials of sperm should you purchase to be safe? A
Um,
question to the clinic.
I'm yeah, definitely a question to the clinic. It's not my
Lovely.
expertise. I'm very much regulation and law.
No worries. And again, everyone, bethan@fertilitynetworkuk.org if anyone wants to ask me a question. And we work with lots of professionals in the field, and I can absolutely get that answered to you. Right, where's this one? Our clinic has said that if we do use donor sperm, I might need HTLV testing. We didn't need this for fertility testing using our own gametes. I was just wondering why this might be needed for the recipient of donor sperm. Thank you.
I don't know why. So HTLV is a really weird virus, a bit like HIV and hepatitis. It's incurable, and if you look it up, I'm sure if you Google it, it'll tell you who's at risk of having HTLV. It can be passed on from mother to child. So that could be one reason why they're recommending you have screening if you have a history that might have made you at risk of having it. So donors have to be screened for HTLV if they are at risk. The law requires that. But recipients, I suspect it may be clinic policy, and they may be concerned that if you are at risk because that's your background, they want to make sure that there's no risk to your future child.
Debra, I realise we've gone over 8 p.m. We've got 2 more questions. Are you happy? Sorry. I am receiving a donor egg. How much of the child will be genetically related, if at all?
A donor egg, genetically related to the person carrying the child?
We will wait for that follow-up question to come through, I think, and I'll go to the second one. Is that okay?
Oh.
No, if I asked about the type 1 diabetes, I have, haven't I? Right. Will my wife's eggs be considered as a donor egg in reciprocal IVF? I think you've answered that, but for clarification.
Yes, that the law says that's how they should be considered at the moment, but my advice on that will be push back a bit.
The follow-up question hasn't come through. They did start it with, if I am receiving a donor egg. So I presume it's, somebody, a woman with a uterus who is needing a donor egg.
I would say none of the DNA of the child will be the DNA of the person carrying the child. So they won't be genetically related to their child at all. But we know that a child's relationship with their parent is much more than genetics.
Thank you. That is the end of the questions. Debra, thank you. Thank you for this evening. We are beyond grateful for you for giving up your time and sharing your knowledge in such a compassionate way. Thank you.
I'd just like to wish everyone good luck in their fertility journey, and it's been a privilege to be with you tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Good night, all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.